Before we get started, many of you know sort of the ground rules for the evening, but if you are new to Books, Booze, and Brains, welcome. We're really happy to have all of you. And we just want to give you a few ground rules so that you can get used to this Zoom environment. When we switched to Zoom in March, we weren't quite sure how it would go, but I think it's been a lot of fun and things seem like they're working well, actually. So thank you to all of you who have made the effort to be here over the past few months. It's really been wonderful to connect with all of you in this environment. So again, Krista Hoffman-Longton, I serve as the moderator for Books, Booze, and Brains, and have had the pleasure of doing this, gosh, for like a year and some change now. So again, really wonderful to see all of you back. Tonight's book that we're talking about with our guest, Chad Priest from the American Red Cross, is World War Z, and Chad is being Vanna for us right now, demoing the book with his incredible Post-it collection there. Very prepared, thank you, Chad. So as a reminder, this event or this program has some amazing sponsors. They are Indiana Humanities, and poor Leah, who usually supports us from Indiana Humanities, seems to be here but may not be here. She got stuck in the Spectrum internet vortex that I know some folks are in this evening. So thank you to Indiana Humanities for supporting this program over the years. Indiana Sciences and March for Science, and Rufus Cochran is behind that Indiana Sciences link there, and is making sure that we get live streamed. So thanks to the Indiana Sciences team for that. And then Central Indiana Science Outreach, which produces amazing programs like Science on Tap and other great programs throughout the state that are all science engagement programs for adults. So happy to have Dr. Jenna Ney from that group, and happy to have you all here this evening. So a few quick words about Zoom. Just make sure you're muted when you're not talking. It'll help us to manage some of the ambient noise that we've got in our homes at any given time. Please be yourself and be respectful of others, particularly in the chat. Sometimes we forget that the things that come out of our fingers aren't exactly how we want them to come out of our mouths. So be kind to one another, be respectful. You can ask questions of Chad and myself using the chat feature in the big room where we're all together. And then in the space where, when we send you into your breakout rooms, which we'll do in a few minutes, you're welcome when you get to your breakout room to go ahead and turn your microphone on. You can use the reactions feature at the bottom of your toolbar to also engage with us. Those are like emojis, and I'll be able to see those, and so will Chad, if you want to just give us a quick reaction. And then lastly, when you turn on your microphone and speak, if we ask you to do that, just a reminder that there's a quick half-second delay. So turn on your mic, take a breath, and then speak, and we won't miss anything that you've said. I think that that's it for our housekeeping items. So let's start the conversation here. So again, welcome, Chad. So happy to have you and happy to talk about this book. It was a ton of fun to read. Would you please tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do and how your work connects to this month's book?
Well, thanks for having me, Krista, and thanks to Indiana Humanities and Indiana Sciences and all of you, some familiar faces here, so it's great to see you all. It's funny, I'm in a different place than I normally am, and it's very cold because I live in a very old house in a very old neighborhood, and the cold weather is like the dampness is coming through, so it's fitting, I think, for Halloween season. So my name is Chad Priest. I am the CEO of the American Red Cross here in Indiana, and I have an additional responsibility as an adjunct faculty member at the School of Medicine, where I work in the Department of Emergency Medicine, the Disaster Medicine Fellowship. So my background, my work prior to coming to the Red Cross, I was the assistant dean at the School of Nursing at IU, and my work is around disaster risk reduction, community-based participatory action research for disaster resilience. So I'm happy to be here and talk. I am not an expert in zombies, but nor am I an expert in literature. And so let me just start out by thanking my resident literature expert, Louise Clendenin, who I know is here with me and who works with me at the Red Cross, who is my go-to person to bounce ideas off of. So she may be, she'll probably talk in the breakouts, but I do want to thank her at the outset for being a great sounding board. And I love this format. And I love this event. It is at least 2 out of the 3 of my favorite things, being booze and books. Brains optional, perhaps. And I want to thank Upland in advance. I'm supporting the cause this evening. Looking forward to talking with you.
Thank you so much, Chad. I think that one of the things that is fun about having you here to talk about this book in specific is that it really does relate directly to what you do in terms of disaster relief. So can you, yeah, right? I mean, I've got some of the questions that I've got for tonight are really focused on kind of the role of the Red Cross and thinking about if there was a zombie apocalypse, what would the Red Cross's role be? But could you talk a little bit, when you say like disaster relief and disaster preparedness, talk about how that sort of relates to what you read in the book for this month.
Well, I mean, look, I don't know if you've all read this book, so I have a couple of just big observations. First of all, I would like to immediately point out that Max Brooks is essentially a stud of a writer. This is a great piece of literature. And I mean that really. I mean, the movie, which I watched only after reading the book, by the way, which is totally different than the book, although, you know, Brad Pitt's in it, and it's a big success. This is actually a sort of a parable for us. And had we all maybe read this a year and a half ago, and had this discussion a year and a half ago, and I know I was with you, we were talking about the great influenza.
Right? I mean, I feel like we're very prescient of us to have planned the great influenza. I know.
Very bad luck. So if tomorrow zombies attack, you know, I apologize. But I think really this book speaks to, in many ways, and I'd love your opinion about this, all of the very predictable ways we're responding to this pandemic, how humans have responded to every pandemic, which is how he was able to write it. It's not like he was a future seer. He simply looked at history. And we're seeing the same things repeat over and over and over and over again, which, by the way, is the story of human behavior in crisis. We are just so predictably I don't want to say dumb, because that's not true, but we are predictable. And I think that's what I saw in this book. And all of my tabs, it's really funny. Every Post-it note in here, every underline, every exclamation, there's a few curse words in here. They all relate to COVID. And I'm just like, oh my goodness gracious. I mean, yes, it's probably too much to expect Americans to understand, you know, a pandemic. I get it. But they could have just read this book. This is accessible. You know, so at any rate, I don't know if that's a great answer to your first question, but there's a lot in here that I think speaks to the way we prepare for and think about crisis. And I use that term more broadly, not just, zombies or, fires or anything else.
So can you give us an example of one thing that you saw in the book? You kind of mentioned the ways in which sort of the rank and file, the average person is sort of underprepared to talk about these issues, to sort of face these issues. Can you give a specific example that you saw in the book that might relate to kind of what you're talking about there?
Yeah, there are so many good things in here. So I mean, this Krista was an unfortunate move by you to just open it up for me to look at like my favorite passages. So you'll have to rein me in.
No
But
worries.
there are there are a few really really good ones in here, and one of them, and there's a great quote, and I'm of course not going to be able to find it now, despite all of my planning. There's a wonderful quote, which I think would be a great thing to talk about, which is that what's the quote about somebody help me, where they talk about oh, come on. I just mentioned it earlier. Oh, yes. For those of you following along, it's page 62. And on page 62, at the last full paragraph, they talk about how media and others are talking about this pandemic, right? This extraordinary incidence in which humans are eating other humans and biting them. And someone says, well, the more all of these eggheads just shouted, the dead are walking, the more most real Americans tuned them out. And I have to just tell you, being one of the eggheads who has spent the last 7.5, 8 months, along with many others, including, by the way, the venerable secretary of our Family Social Services Administration, Dr. Jen Walthall. Jen, welcome. Who have
Welcome,
been
Dr.
shouting
Walthall.
from the rooftops about this disease and how we work. And boy, as a health comms person, Krista, as an expert in how we communicate about health, this must be resonant for you in a big way, because of course, the more I talk about COVID and mask wearing and social responsibility and solidarity, the more we see the very predictable reaction, which is, stop it. You're encroaching on my freedom, America, stop it. And this is very common, especially in infectious disease outbreaks. But there are ways to mitigate these things in advance. We just haven't done it here. So I don't know. That's one of about a bazillion.
One of the many, right? Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that is really powerful that you talk about there, Chad, is that notion of asking folks to behave in a more collectivist way, right? That it's really hard to ask folks to sort of think about their relationship to others and how that shapes their behavior, because we're human. We tend to be pretty self-centered, right? So we're thinking about myself and my family, not necessarily thinking about others. And I think that that's one of the things for me that came out as I read this, was just how in those times of crisis, it's very hard, at least particularly in my circles, it's very hard sometimes, I think, for people to see that their job is not just about protecting them and the people that they love, but thinking about kind of more humankind.
Well, I love that, right? Because one of the things that we did early on in this pandemic, which every government, every Red Cross, every NGO on the planet does at the beginning of any outbreak, is focus on solidarity messaging that, by the way, Krista, you might tell us, hey, that never works. You'd probably be right, but we always do it at first. We always focus on social solidarity. And on page, I think 138. Yes, on 138, they're and I can't even remember who's speaking. This is the guy in New Mexico, which is actually one of my favorite characters in this book, by the way. And he's talking about how if his father had been alive, he would just remember FDR and World War II and all of the things that we did to come about. I think that the phrase in here is methods that were Marxist in nature, truly, right? That were just radically progressive. And and this particular person ran away to Wall Street to sort of shut all that out, which was an effective strategy probably. But yes, this idea that collectivism truly is critical to the survival of our species. And we know this, like evolutionary biologists, and they would say, of course, that's a no-brainer. Yet we seem to forget all of that in the middle of things, but not at the beginning. So I don't know about you, but I have been walking. I know every inch of my neighborhood, which is an unintended, but I think positive outcome of the pandemic. And I mean, I have this app called Fog of War, it's called Fog of something, Fog of the World, and it runs in the background. You may know this app, but anyway, it maps everywhere I go. and all the maps are foggy until I've walked there and it uncovers the mountain. For someone with pretty severe um, achievement related OCD, this is important for me. So I'm going down alleys and places to get the map unfogged. But I say this because in March, I could walk unencumbered anywhere down the middle of Meridian Street. I could walk. There were no cars. There were no people. Right? We had enough there was enough fright associated with COVID to make a lockdown work for a brief period of time. And of course, that's not a sustainable strategy. And whether we did it as the government or whether people did it individually, people would come back out. But when we appealed to individuals' fear, we got a great reaction. We got a great reaction. Don't leave the house. You might die, right? Great reaction. Then we started saying, this mask, it's not for you. It's for the other person. And at that moment, we lost the game. Truly, we failed to appreciate how little, until it's existential, people care about the other. And I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing. I just think we were kind of amateur hour in playing to that. We should have known better. Yes, collectivism rules the day if we are to stay alive. Barring our ability to transmit that complex message, which I'll leave to you, Krista, as an expert, we really can't expect huge differences unless there is an existential personal threat. And then, of course, as we've seen from some famous politicians lately, everything changes. Well, actually, now that I've been faced with this threat, I have a very different perspective. I know what I've said for the last 6 months. Please, let's listen to something different now. These are not surprising things.
Well, and I think I think that one of the things that's powerful about what you're saying there is that notion of being able to see multiple perspectives at once, right? That it's hard sometimes to ask folks to kind of get outside themselves and see not just my perspective, but the perspective of those around me. And so that kind of leads me to our first Turn and Talk question. And as a reminder for folks to how we do these Turn and Talk questions in the Zoom world is that we'll send you to a breakout room, and I assign those breakout rooms totally randomly. Chad, you'll stay here in the main room with me and we'll talk about this question together. But the rest of you will be magically transported to a room with some new friends. So get a chance to meet your new friends. And here's the question that I would like you to talk about, if you would, in your breakout rooms. Of course, you can talk about anything else you want to, but also this is the question. So I'm always doing research prior to reading the book and prior to preparing for tonight's session. And I read somewhere that Max Brooks really sort of tried to channel Studs Terkel, one of my favorite public intellectuals, in terms of writing this book, writing it from multiple perspectives. And for those of you that don't know, Studs Terkel was a historian. He wrote a book called The Great War that was really a collection of perspectives about that experience. So here's the sort of official question. So World War Z has, I think, 43, if I counted right, 43 different characters telling their individual stories, not including the interviewer who, Max Brooks obviously considers himself the interviewer. So my question for you is, what do you think are the advantages of having so many perspectives and having so many locations in this book? How might someone's identity and culture inform their approach to a pandemic like this one? And like I said, I know that Leah is not, I think, fully connected tonight. So I'm going to, look at some amazing person. Thank you, Leah. Somehow managed to get this question into the chat. Again, Leah, you're the best. Okay, so we have 43 perspectives of this book. What is the advantage of having so many perspectives in this book? And how might someone's identity and culture inform their approach to a pandemic? So with that, I'm gonna adjust here and open up the breakout rooms so that everyone has an opportunity to chat with one another.
Super cool, by the way. I think what's about to happen is the cool thing that happens during.
Yeah, I think it's pretty exciting.
Maybe I'm a boomer about it, but this is pretty cool.
So we'll see how this works in terms of moving folks from breakout to breakout here. And let's see here, make sure that we've got some folks in every room. And if you're having trouble joining your breakout room, just shoot me a quick chat and let me know that you're having trouble joining, and I can move you around where needed. And of course, Chad has left to go to a breakout room instead of staying in the main room.
I got
and Chad's
invited
back.
to a breakout room, and I
Sorry,
said, yes,
Chad, you were
showed
like,
up there, and I'm
yay!
like, I shouldn't be here. I have to come back.
Sorry, Chad. It just happens automatically. The magic of Zoom.
Good chance for me to replace my beer. So give me a second, and
I will absolutely give you a second. Replace your beer. Come back and let's chat about this question.
sorry about that. I had to navigate children saying, maybe I should come say hello. And I said, that'd be fine. You're welcome.
Yeah, they can come say hello. Absolutely.
They're all making sure they don't make any noise. I'm like, it's
Oh
fine.
no.
I hear you. I loved this. I loved the way he did it. This sort of oral history approach. I thought it was great.
So too. I mean, I feel like, again, when I think about this question about individualism versus collectivism and how do we get people to behave relatively more collectively, knowing that it's going to be hard, right? I mean, it's just, as somebody who works in higher education in the United States is not a public good anymore, right? The reason why we, why we go to school is to get a job. And so, pushing folks toward thinking about what does it mean to sort of take care of the people around me. And I think the other thing that makes this hard is that it's not as, and this is the thing about the zombie apocalypse, is that it's not super acute, right? It's not like 9/11. It's not like an earthquake. It's not like right? So yep. You're talking about sort of the communicative responses to disaster. When it's a hurricane, when it's one moment in time, yep. It's very easy to think about how do we come together. But this long slog is very hard for people to attend outward instead of inward.
Oh my gosh, yeah, for sure. And in fact, it's really interesting because this book, right, Rebecca Solnit, is actually a fantastic. Have you ever read this? You should.
I don't think I have. No, I love Rebecca Solnit. Yeah, that's amazing.
I never read her before. I'll send you a copy of the book.
Oh, she's great.
She does a history of disaster sociology related to how people communities react in crisis, and she kind of traces it from the first, from the 1800s in the California, like San Francisco fires, and communities do all these predictable things. They come together, they help each other. Like there is, as you say, this natural emergence of support. And what's not discussed in her book, and I don't know anything about, is, well, what happened during 1918? We had a war going, so it was really different. I mean, I know what happened in, people did the same shit they're doing now, right? But I think you're right. There's some point at which, and I think there's this comment in this book, which I love, which I might mention when we return, which is this idea that public support has to be husbanded as a finite resource.
What page is that?
It's 52. And they say it must be spent wisely, sparingly, and with the greatest return on investment, because America is especially sensitive to war weariness, and nothing brings on a backlash like the perception of defeat. And so this idea that we have to husband popular opinion so carefully and spend that capital so wisely, is really remarkable. I mean, among many other terrible things in this book, including their attempted herd immunity.
Well, right. And I think that one of the things, kind of to your point about that, is that just the extent to which Brooks was prescient, I think, in a lot of ways in writing this story, and talks about, sort of the media response, et cetera. One of the things I think that he couldn't have predicted is, and I mean, it was right at the beginning of what I would call this era of attention economy, right? Where there's like so much of it is about how do I media outlet keep your attention? And so if we're talking about the notion of like husbanding popular opinion, that becomes really challenging when there are so many choices that I have to attend to. And I can just buy into my confirmation bias, right? I can just listen to the same stuff that I've always listened to that supports my opinions and support my perspective. And I don't need to listen to whatever experts are saying if I don't want to. I can just listen to people parrot back to me what my feelings are, which how affirming is that when I'm feeling a little raw and kind of
I like that, by the way. I'm in for that. I do that all
right?
Yeah, we all do. It's really interesting. We've perhaps for a different discussion, but we've been working on this 3-phased approach to sort of prepare communities in Indiana for a potential COVID vaccine. And we started with sort of talking about mask wearing, and then we were working on the flu vaccination, and it's just really been interesting listening. Anyway, it's a space I'm new to, and it's absolutely fascinating. Just how challenging it is to move people from this idea of self-preservation, which, by the way, is of course tied to the other. And I don't know what the trick is. I know from work during Ebola what doesn't work, and we know like quarantining is usually very unsuccessful. Cordon sanitaires don't work. I mean, we know what doesn't work, but our toolkit is so rudimentary. I mean, these are really all we have. This is really your area. I mean, in really ways, Krista, have you just been like looking at TV every day being like, oh my gosh, what's going on?
So we can talk about that. Like one of my, I think I put it in the question about hope is the extra question.
Oh, we should get to that one. You should ask. I would love to hear what you have to say about that.
I have a lot of feelings. I have a lot of feelings about hope. I feel all the feels about hope. I mean, I'm not a feeler, right? Like I don't feel all the feels about anything. I can tell, I understand what feeling is for, and I understand how feeling is persuasive, and I don't feel the feels, except when we talk about hope. And so, that's fun. So yeah, we might get to that at the end. All right, let me call these folks back, and then we will, and then we'll talk about kind of your response in the large group. And we'll get some of their perspectives too. All right, looks like folks are coming back. So happy to see you all. Kim, Amy, Jen, Hannah, so good to see you guys. I feel like it's been ages since we've seen each other in person. Sheil, how are you? Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
It's just really fun to see all your faces. All right, folks are coming back. Looks like they're having really good conversations. I always know we're having good conversations when folks are like apprehensive to return to the main room. Leah, did you want to say something?
No, she said. No, I don't.
No, I don't. I was trying to make sure I was muted again.
It was muted.
That's okay, Leah. I'll mute you. No worries. I have all the power.
I love the disembodied nature of the chat too, by the way, because we have different personalities. There's the Zoom personality when we're talking, but then we're different in the chat. I love that, actually. Our shadow side can come out in the chat. Maybe we're a little snarkier in the chat.
Yeah. Right. Well, for better or worse, right? And then like the, communication professor in me is like, be kind to one another. You don't know the words that come out of your fingers.
Yeah.
Look at Jen. Oh, look at your four-legged friend. So fun. All right, so we had a great, Chad refilled his beer. We had a great conversation while you all were gone. I hope that you all had good conversations too. For those of you that do not have your cameras on, if your bandwidth allows and you're in a place where you can turn your camera on, it's always really good to see your faces. I miss seeing all of you. Chad and I talked a little bit more about this individualism versus collectivism thing, and why maybe having all of these multiple stories could help us to get some perspectives about this issue. Before we jump into Chad's response though, I always like to hear from the groups first. So if someone had like a particularly interesting conversation or particularly interesting set of questions that came up, we'd love to hear from you, and you're welcome to turn on your mic. So the question for this breakout session was, there are about 40 different perspectives in World War Z. What do you think are the advantages of having so many perspectives and so many physical locations? And how might someone's identity, characteristics, and culture inform their approach to the pandemic? So anybody have any good conversations that they're willing to share? Just go ahead and turn on your mic.
Hey, Krista, you know me. If no one speaks up, I will.
Thanks, Jen. Always happy to have you.
Yeah, sorry, my bandwidth's not doing too hot, so you get black screen. So we talked about how you really, if anybody's following any of the COVID news, you see why it's so important to get so many perspectives. Different governments are treating this in different ways. Different countries have been hit different amounts, and who's been targeted, your social class effects, how you're being treated, your beliefs are affecting how you view this, where you work. I was even saying, people are getting kind of shamed for doing things, but some things that they have to do. So there was a big thing back when New York City opened back up, and they said avoid public transportation, and they were shaming all these people for taking public transportation. But that, I lived in New York City for a while, and for those who don't make six figures, that's the only way you're getting to work. And if you haven't worked in 3 months, you're going to take it. So, it's one of those things, like, even then, if, people shaming people for taking public transportation, if they had spoken from their perspective and just been like, okay, you're living in a big city, you haven't worked in 3 months, this is the only way you can get to work, then you're like, oh, okay, that makes more sense. Maybe we should have done something a different way. So I think COVID has really showed everybody in this group just how much these little differences in how you live and work and where you live and work affect how you're going to be thinking and reacting to this kind of thing.
That's a really good point, Jen, that there are significant class considerations that I think, here in Central Indiana, because we are such a car dependent culture, in some ways. I read a great article in the Atlantic a couple of months ago that asked if your car was sort of the ultimate PPE. Like, was your car, which was a really, I thought, an interesting question to ask, right? That, I have for many years lamented the idea that I'm so dependent on my car living here in Indianapolis. I grew up and lived in Chicago. And, there's a period of time where I didn't own a car because I only took public transportation. And I think that you're right to say that being in a space where we are kind of so reliant on the resources that we have can be potentially very challenging. The other thing I think that's important to what you mentioned is that notion of shame and the extent to which we know that shame is one of the only messages that never works. Whether you're talking about the HIV crisis in the 80s, or you're talking about smoking, or you're talking about the pandemic, shame, the idea of shaming someone into doing something, never works. And so I think as we think about kind of what are the messages that work, I think that it's really important to remember that, we have some tools that we can use, and we have an infinite number of messages. It's just a matter of making sure that we understand where folks are coming from and really kind of trying to take advantage of that. Chad, why don't you talked a little bit about that quote, and I want to kind of amplify some of Chad's ideas about this, that was about sort of popular opinion and the role of popular opinion in being able to kind of create public support and how that relates to multiple perspectives. So I went back and looked at the chat. On page 52, is where you were kind of pulling from, Chad. Do you want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, it's just, as I read, sort of lines will strike me and I'll underline them. This was just one. It was this idea that public support has to be husbanded. Let me read it. It's got to be husbanded as a finite national resource. It must be spent wisely, sparingly, and with the greatest return on your investment, because America is especially sensitive to war weariness, and nothing brings on a backlash like the perception of defeat. And it struck me as I read this that we all know it to be true. Like this is, I think a lot of times I'll underline things that like, yeah, I agree with that, Max. That's right. Good job, right? But it's true because it's true. That some of our disappointment, regardless of your political affiliation, with sort of our handling of the pandemic, probably stems from our expectation that someone other than us will rally us and lead us forward in some way to give us, and I know Krista will talk about this later, maybe hope or some path forward. And what I think maybe I was describing, and maybe the way I said it wasn't as articulate, this idea that I could walk down the middle of Meridian Street in March, but in June could have been killed 70 times over with the traffic, exhibits just this, which is we squander at our peril solidarity. And America likes to win. Americans like to win. And messages of defeat challenge what we believe to be the story of America. I mean, I don't know. I mean, we tell kids America's about winning. Think of all the people we had to subjugate and the places we had to, get through to make it in America, right? We don't say subjugate, we say persevere and whatnot. But the reality is we love to win in America. And if we aren't really winning, we'll just tell ourselves we'll win. And once you've told yourself you've won, well, then you can just go get a beer at the pub. They're with like 150 of your friends because
right next to one another.
Dinner. Yeah,
right
now you could just lick each other if you want. So I do think there is this idea that you start with a limited amount of capital in terms of solidarity, and you've got to spend it really wisely. And I think when people talk about leadership in public health crises, it's less about technical leadership and more about, not to pull a Joe Biden, but one of those where you're just looking in the camera and say, I know what you're talking about at the kitchen table, right? Which is, I know what you're worried about. And we haven't seen that on, again, nonpartisan. We have not seen that in America in a way that I think we would have expected to. That to me, by the way, personally has been a great disappointment. Maybe like you, I've sat in my living room and looked at the TV and said, oh my God, I could have written a better speech. and I think about these things a lot, but it wouldn't have taken me that long to get this right. And the truth is, I think a lot of us felt that way, where we were like, all you have to do is say, no, it's hard. It's hard. We're asking a lot of sacrifice. It's going to be tough.
Well, and I think I think that piece about empathy, I mean, again, this is me like putting my science communicator, health communicator hat on, right? Like that piece about empathy is really critical. That if I am going to care about the people that are around me, I need to know them. And that's what good stories do, right? And so, when I think about the question that I asked all of you, which was why 46, however many, 43 stories plus the 44 stories, some of it is about really understanding someone else's experience. And that's one of the things that Turkle, for example, was super interested in helping others understand what it was like to live during this time. And if we look at the messages, if you take even something like race relations, for example, and you look at what is effective in combating, combating sort of racist ideology and racist talk, the programs that have been most effective are those programs that are often asking an individual to have dinner with someone who is very different than them, right? And so that goes back to this notion of how important, my Siri doesn't understand. So
always listening.
See, always right there. And so I think I think as we think about kind of what this issue is, I think that what we're getting toward is thinking about sort of Chad and I, our jobs are to make decisions based on data, right? We look at the data, we look at the data about human behavior, and we make decisions that we know will best support the folks that we need to support. And that said, it's still very helpful to hear those stories, because I think that they orient us toward why we do that work and give us the kind of tools and resources that we need to do work that is culturally relevant and has sort of the most legs, can get in the community in the way that we need it to.
So
Yeah.
this is
Hey, Michael, how are you?
Good. So if I could make two quick points. First of all, I caught an interview with Max Brooks a couple weeks ago. And he also wrote the screenplay to the movie, which I didn't know. The one thing that has shocked him, he says, I would have never thought when I wrote the book or wrote the movie that the government, the leadership, would be as bad as it is. He says, quite frankly, if I took wrote a movie screenplay that the government as acting as it is right now, Hollywood have laughed me out of the studio. And I think that kind of goes back to what you were saying, Chad, about we just have to a 5,000-pound gorilla in a room is lack of leadership at the national level. Second of all, I think what you were saying, which we has been a common theme through a lot of our books, is the lack of science, knowledge, and education by the common people, by the population. And I know some of the science organizations, American Society for Microbiology, American Society for Virology, and et cetera, American Public Health Association, have lamented for probably 30 years. I've seen surveys, them saying, we're concerned about the lack of science education and its long-term effect on our population. And here we are today. We don't believe scientists about this. We don't believe them about, we don't even know what a GMO is. We don't understand global warming. I mean, there's a whole range of science-based issues that we have. And no matter how good and how knowledgeable we are, and I can tell you, I've talked to so many people, they just aren't going to believe science. Oh, the numbers are fake. Oh, the doctors are getting money and hospitals are getting money for COVID reports. So there's not 200,000 some dead. There's only maybe 20. Why is it when a 80-year-old man who has a heart disease dies of COVID that we should call it a COVID death? It's just stunning, the lack of knowledge in people who are not in science occupations. And that is, I think, to me, is the root, one of the roots of the problems we're having right now.
So
I love that. Oh, I'm sorry, Krista, go ahead.
No, I would like you to speak, Chad. You go.
No, no, it's like we're like such Hoosiers. No, really, after you.
Because really, after you, no, you.
No, Mike, I love it. And I will just say this. Yes, of course, I agree. Everybody should understand that that scientific literacy matters and whatnot. I agree with you completely. I will also say, without disagreeing with you in any way, I think Barbara Caper talked about ways of knowing, and it's interesting because my work, actually, I don't work with numerical data at all. I'm a qualitative researcher. I was trained in qualitative methods. I'm also a lawyer. I was trained in legal research methods. How I know and understand the world around me is markedly different than most of my colleagues. And
Chad, I totally didn't know that. Do you know that I'm almost exclusively a qualitative researcher too? We're the worst people ever to run this conversation.
Yeah, we are totally the worst. Now, I love quantitative data, and I actually appreciate the enormity of insight that raw quantitative data can
Agree,
provide.
right? I can do multivariate work like the best of them. It's just I feel like the qualitative work gives us information that we wouldn't have had otherwise.
Well, it's what I always tell people, which is my experience is in fact a data point. Now, it may not be a knowable, testable hypothesis. I understand that, but that doesn't mean it doesn't matter. And so, Michael, I think this is the challenge for science, big S science, and we are all complicit in this. I think all of us, which is, yes, I agree with you. It would be perfect if people bought into what we believe to be the truth we're living in, right? Yes, absolutely, Krista, absolutely. However, knowing that they don't, I think it's incumbent upon scientists to not reduce, not be reductionist in our approach. That's not what we're being called to do, but to appreciate that the truth that we see is not the truth that everyone else may see. And I think we have to do that. Not first of all, we have to do it because it's the reality around us, but it also will make us better. We will be better for it. The truth is that we're not going to convince everyone of anything. That's not our job. But I do think that we have to sort of look at ourselves and say, okay, our dogma, and it is dogma, our dogma, which we believe people should accept, may be having a tough time right now, right? Why is that? Well, I'll tell you one reason why, is that our solutions to the pandemic suck. Our solutions suck. The same solutions we have now are the ones we had, in 15th century Europe. So how's that for your dogma?
No, I thoroughly agree. Sorry, go ahead.
I mean, now listen, we understand things better. We're doing Operation Warp Speed to immunization. Obviously, it's not the same. I'm sort of exaggerating for emphasis, right? Our understanding is so much more nuanced. But the outcome for the average person who's living their lives is this the best we could come up with? This? And you hear Anthony Fauci, I think, more than any other scientist in public, also saying, I know this is tough to hear. And I love listening to Dr. Fauci talk because you can see the tension in his face. You can just see him go, I'm so smart. I know so much. I know what to do. And unfortunately, the thing I'm going to ask you to do is going to sound like something out of like 1690. And I know that's going to disappoint. So it's a tricky one. For sure, but I agree with you, Michael, completely. And by the way, politically, not being partisan, but there is a definite view about the criticality of science education that is not shared universally in our society. That's just undeniably the truth. That's a huge problem that we need to correct pretty quickly.
So Chad, I'm noticing that Amy turned on her mic, and I want to make sure that Amy gets a chance to talk.
Yeah.
So Amy, go ahead.
One of the things that, in thinking about the book versus what's going on today, in one of the ways that the book is like Studs Terkel, is every person's testimony and every person's voice is presented as is, and whoever is compiling this is an impartial listener. So throughout the book, there's no judgment that's laid against what anyone has done or what anyone has said. It's just presented as their reality. And it's really left up to the reader to decide how they feel about it. And today with media, with speeches, we talk about it's important to tell a story, but a lot of times when we're telling the story, we're also giving a moral. We're not leaving it at a point where people can make their own decisions. We're trying to lead them to a decision. And it's that emotional twist to it, I think, is also where people start to get really hung up.
I think that the emotional twist does create a scenario where folks get hung up. And at the same time, given Chad, one of the things that Chad and I talked about was sort of attention economy, right? The idea that, Max Brooks wrote this book kind of at the early end of some of our social media experiences. And so how we think about what folks can attend to and how folks choose to make decisions about what they can attend to really shapes their understanding of what a pandemic actually looks like. And I don't know, Chad, if you want to comment on that a little bit before we move on to our next turn and talk question.
I don't. I think we should turn. That was such a well-stated point, Amy, and I really appreciated it. And I think it's right. And there's some good stuff, by the way, in the chat, which you should read the chat. There's some good stuff happening in the chat.
There is great stuff happening in the chat. And thanks to all of you who are continuing to have that great conversation in the chat. One of the things that's hard about the Zoom space is that I'm moving back and forth between and sort of trying to keep track of both and not really doing justice to either. So do attend to the chat. I know Leah is in there encouraging great conversation. So I want to go to our next turn and talk question. And this one is really focused on sort of thinking about zombieism within the context of the current pandemic and other potential challenges that humans face. So here's the question. In what ways, if any, does zombieism reflect infectious disease? How is disease spread? And are there existing diseases with similar epidemiologies? Which I know not everyone's an epidemiologist, but you get it, right? So in what ways does zombieism reflect infectious disease? How does disease spread? And are there existing diseases with similar epidemiologies? And Leah, I don't know if you can make that to the chat. And if not, I'll pause myself for a minute and get it to the chat. Look at Leah's amazing. See, this is.
And I will not go into the room this time. I made the error of
Well, that's okay, Chad. I would
doing
have
whatever
come to,
Zoom
I would have
tells me
come
to
to
do.
find you. It's all good. All right, so I'm going to send you all to rooms except for Chad. And have a great conversation. Copy and paste that if you want to take it with you into the breakout room. And we'll be back in about 10 minutes or so. Opening breakout rooms now. All right, folks are headed to their breakout rooms. And we have some folks that are still here. Let's see. Nancy, do you want to join a breakout? Or do you want to stick around here? Totally up to you. Watching the chat.
Hey, this is Nancy. I'm probably best off staying in here because I'm audio only because I'm listening into this while I'm cleaning cat boxes. Speaking of pandemic and terrible things. So there we go.
No worries, Nancy.
Yeah, no worries at all.
Happy to have you.
Thank you.
In the main room. Feel free to listen along. Chad and I will just continue our usual our usual not so interesting banter.
It was
Oh.
fascinating last time. I caught it last go around. Just
All right.
Oh, that's funny.
So
Okay.
I'm all ears. I'm all ears and up to my elbows in detergents. So there we go.
No worries.
That's
Thank
great.
you.
That's great.
We're always happy to have shared friends in this main space. So Chad, what do you think about this one? Like, what are, obviously we talked about the great influenza, right? Like, I can't believe, like, I went back and looked at that video at the beginning of the pandemic and kind of cried a little
How'd we
bit. Was
do?
like,
Did we predict it? Did we predict everything exactly as?
I mean, we were pretty good.
I mean, it's not us.
Have you met
It's
us?
just
Right.
humans. We do the same over and over and over. I mean, it's really, yeah, it's remarkable. There is this great passage we should talk about when we return about it's on page.
I'm gonna record it in the chat, so you tell me.
Do you remember when they put everybody into the East Coast and they put them in, it's on page 109, they put them into these safe zones, and those people in these safe zones were designed to attract zombies to them, ostensibly to be eaten.
Right.
So that other people could get away. And what I wrote at the time, and I read this, I think over the summer, was what a scary parallel to the herd immunity discussion, because that's exactly what it is, right? This idea that a really misconstrued understanding of how herd immunity works, which is we use human bait. And that's essentially what has been proposed now, which is that we sacrifice Black and brown people, people who have a lower socioeconomic status, in order to somehow, and it's such a crude understanding of how herd immunity works. That's not even how it works, but they think that's how it works, and so they've latched onto this thing, and it's just struck me as really horrific. But yes, the obvious stuff is yes, you get bitten, you get the disease, and I also pulled up Koch's postulates. Is it Koch or Koch? How do you say Koch? The German?
I am not.
Do you remember?
I am not sure. That's a really good question. I'd have to go back and like reread.
It's one you
some of
don't
my-
want to get wrong. But
Right?
yes. I mean,
I
this
think, is
idea
it
that
Cook? Do you just say Cook? It might be the
German, I think.
anglicized pronunciation. I'm not sure.
KOCH is postulates. I always, is it Koch? Hey,
I think
Eli,
it's
did you
Koch.
learn about scientific method in school yet? Nah, exactly. No.
Mm,
Public
no,
school
right.
kid. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. But anyway, this idea that like one of your first questions, we didn't really talk about it, was like the rise of zombie obsession in America.
Right. Yeah.
And
I sort of skipped that one because we were kind of short on time. But if you want to go back to it, we can talk about
I
it.
think it's a great question though, Krista, because it's all sort of related. I think it's related to this infectious disease question, this idea that, okay, yeah, like zombie stories have been told forever, and fake death, and like being buried before you're really dead, and the little bells and the coffins and all the old things we did. That collided with germ theory.
Right.
And now people were like, oh my gosh. So now you have this story of the undead, and I can bite you and give it to you, which, by the way, is a pretty remarkable thing. We didn't even understand. We're still talking about homunculuses and little people that lived in our bodies and stuff,
Right.
you know, and hot and cold foods and whatever. But anyway, yeah, it's just something. I watched that. It's funny you say that, because I did two things in late February, early March. I read The Plague, and I watched our video of that thing, and I remember thinking, yeah, it was really tragic. Really tragic.
Like, I have thought about that I have thought about that conversation that we had so many times, because like I almost wanted, I don't know, I should ask you about this. We'll talk about this maybe later, but I thought about taking the recording, because obviously we have the recording, and submitting it to the Indiana Historical Society, you know, is creating the COVID, you know, the kind of COVID, what are they calling it? Like an archive.
Yeah.
That we had that conversation. It was January,
December,
is that right?
January.
December,
Yeah,
I mean, it was like right before.
Yeah.
And we were living in, like, I mean, you know, our usual fantasy world where there's a lot of hope again.
Clueless. Yeah. Clueless.
And we had this great conversation about this book that I, you know, had always wanted to read, and I read, and, you know, to have the conversation with you. And I really think that we were, you know, we laughed about things like mass graves. And I remember having that conversation. And then afterward, it was March. And I remember thinking, like, I'm the most tone deaf person on the planet. Right.
No,
like,
no.
You couldn't have known, right? Not, you know, we couldn't have known, but it is that really like intense moment of like.
It's funny because we in those early heady days in Indiana, the epidemic, before we understood what was going on, I was involved in a lot of these really frightening discussions about what are we going to do? The hospitals are overwhelmed. How are we going to get through this? And that stuff, the stuff that's scary sounding, that's really visceral, that's the easy stuff.
Yeah.
How we figure out beds, how we figure out deaths. What I was totally just caught off guard in huge ways. I remember mocking in my head, if not on our interview, I have to go back and look, this idea. Remember the parade in Philly, the super spreader parade?
Yeah,
right?
The super spreader. Yeah.
And thinking, that's absurd.
People aren't
We're
going to
so
do
much more
that.
sophisticated, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Talk about really wrong. Talk about just not seeing history the way just being way off base, and being like, wow, that's what we should have been planning for. None of the logistic stuff matters. So.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think that when we think about kind of what we're asking folks to do, like I said, that it's that thinking fast and slow concept, right? And we are consistently asking people to think slow. And I just think it's really hard. I think day in, day out, it gets overwhelming.
Yeah, totally agree. But that was really an awkward conversation. It's funny, I was in Strasbourg, France, delivering a talk at an international conference. I took my daughter in December, and Strasbourg is like the Christmas capital of Europe, and it's just
so
full
beautiful.
Of people. And yeah, it is gorgeous. I'd never been. It was stunning. But it was also the outbreak of the European pandemic in December while I was there. And just reflecting back on just being so ignorant in the moment, how it's just a really powerful feeling. We'll have a lot of processing to do, I think, over the next several years. And I hope we do that with the sort of thoughtfulness that it deserves. Although I worry that we'll forget and kind of get back to.
Nancy, I can see you're on video now. Do you want to share anything since you're here with us?
Yes, well,
Glad to be here with the camera on. I'm done with my housekeeping. So now in the spirit of the booze part, I'm mixing myself a drink very shortly. Something to compare with Chad, you talked about being in Strasbourg around Christmas. I was on a cruise ship in the first week of February.
Oh my gosh, Nancy.
Goodness gracious.
So
oh my
I
God.
was just reading that, and I was just kind of okay, what kind of bullets are we dodging or not dodging, and what's going on here, and
Was
how
there
serious?
an outbreak on your ship that you knew of?
No, not in the least, no.
Good.
And
Good.
yeah, so we dodged that bullet, but it was just something where all of this was going on, and I'm thinking we could possibly be in the middle of something very similar. And you just wonder. So.
Wow. And I think it does kind of illustrate the idea that particularly because I was reading an article today in the Atlantic about the sort of R factor versus the K factor, right?
Mhm.
That is kind of thinking about how sort of the concept of spreading has changed and how we understand what it means to sort of spread the virus in different ways. And so I'm glad to hear that you were safe. And in
Yeah.
some ways, just like you said, that the sort of not knowing just meant that you could get off the ship quickly, get back home, and be safe, which is good, because I think sometimes a lot of work is challenging at that moment, right? Is to think about like, how do you not be controlled by the emotion?
Yeah. One thing, as people come back, I know that we've got like a minute before everybody else comes back in the room. You talked about the R naught values and so forth, and then we talked about information being disseminated inaccurately and the Fauci face. That was a brilliant description of tension there. And then talking about making sure that information is sent correctly, and that false information is not propagated by way of social media and so forth. And of course, I saw this on social media. Once you have that with the right people, give you the right information, you have nerd immunity, which is even better. So I wish I could find that.
I love that. Oh, that's great. That's
we
great.
can achieve nerd immunity. This will be what it is.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's funny. We
So on that
definitely,
note,
that's better than herd immunity for sure.
Yes. Yeah, it's a different R naught value for
Yeah, for sure it is.
propagated incorrectly. So
Yeah, I agree. Nancy, for the win here on nerd immunity. I'm going to use that. Guarantee I use that.
Yeah, it's just something random I saw on Facebook, which tells you what kind of friends I hang out with. I like my friends. So that was, I saw that, and it was
And
great
keeping
to see.
you safe and healthy. Absolutely.
Yes.
So welcome back, everyone. Really good to see you all. Chad and I had a great conversation. Nancy was connected in kind of an odd way, and so she decided to hang out with us, which was actually really fun. So thanks, Nancy, for hanging out with us while we could. I hope y'all had great conversations in your breakouts. So the question in the breakout room was, in what ways, if any, does zombieism reflect existing infectious disease, whether we talk about COVID or other infectious disease? How does disease spread? And are there existing diseases with similar epidemiologies? And so, Chad, you sort of talked a little bit about kind of what we saw in the early stages of the pandemic and how that changed over time. I'm not sure if you want to comment on this question or just more broadly on the conversation we had.
Yeah, I got so excited about nerd immunity that I forgot everything we talked about. But I did have this. There's this on page 109. There's a description of the safe zones that were created. And by the way, when your government tells you to go to a safe zone, can we all just agree it's probably not safe? And I don't care what country you're in. I don't care what kind of government it is. Can we just all agree if you're asked to go to a safe zone? It's like one of those, it's like a George Carlin joke. Like if they have to call it a safe zone, it's probably not. So just as a general rule, you leave here with that pearl of wisdom. Now, listen, you might say, what does Chad Priest know about safe zones? I'll show you what I know. At the entrance of my home is this art piece, which is actually every zombie safe zone in the United States. And they are actually national parks that have sufficient resources to keep me safe from a potential zombie attack. This isn't a joke. I didn't think I'd actually need this, of course, when I bought it. The safe zones, by the way, are concentrated in places where there are national parks, which, by the way, I'm not sure is the right place to be, just as we see about where parks tend to be around the country, but that's a different discussion, probably more political than we want to have here. But having said that, there is this description on page 109 in the book where they talk about the safe zones, and that those people that were left behind on the East Coast of the country during the zombie attack were told to go to these safe zones. They were there to be, it says that their job was essentially to be human bait, distracting the undead from following the retreating army to their safe zone, the real safe zone apparently, and that these isolated and uninfected refugees had to be kept alive for the sole purpose of attracting more zombies to come and eat them. And you see the genius, the sickness of this is to keep people alive as prisoners, because every zombie besieging those survivors will be one less zombie throwing themselves against our real defenses, presumably on the less safe but you stay alive zone to the West Coast. This is essentially a discussion of herd immunity, and the idea that we would sacrifice some. By the way, this is a description of a perverted and poorly understood concept of herd immunity, not the actual herd immunity we would understand, but this idea that we talked about herd immunity in the popular media, which is let's just get enough people sick and then we don't have to worry about it. That is, by the way, sports fans, not how herd immunity works. But the fact that we have an entire chorus of fellow citizens willing to throw Black and brown lives literally into a funeral pyre in order to go to their local restaurant or bar is the exact same thing that we see here in this book. And is that really a surprise? We do this all the time. This is sort of standard fare for Americans. This is how we have organized our social structures. The fact that we're doing it in a pandemic may seem shocking. It may strike us as shocking, but the reality is we do it all the time. Who gets healthcare? Who gets access to vaccines? Who gets access to, I don't know, homes? These are decisions we make every day about how people should live. I think that we're doing it in a pandemic just seems sort of de rigueur, right? This is sort of how we operate. I was struck, though, because as I was reading this book over the summer, this was the first nascent idea that maybe what we should do is just let this thing go. Let it go. I don't know anyone that has it. I don't know anyone that looks like me that has it. Let it go. That's a horrific zombie level thought. Not only about the outcome, but about ourselves. And that to me, I think was probably the most emotional piece of this book, was that how easy was it for Max Brooks to write that line? Very easy, because it's so core to who we are. That should, I think, disturb all of us to some degree. So you should feel free to bring up hope anytime, Krista.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that that's one of the things that is, for me, the hardest thing about reading this book during this time is this question about that. Again, I'm going to go back to that individualism versus collectivism thing, because I think that it is fundamental to our conversations. And, Leah wrote in the chat, I'm glad we're talking about the ethics and morality of arguments about herd immunity. I have a wonderful friend who works for Amazon right now and is delivering all of those packages to your house. And I have another really good friend who works for Kroger, who's making sure that your click list order is ready. And I think that when we think about, and, not to mention all the great friends that I have that work in the emergency department, that work, that work on the front lines of this issue. And I think as we think about kind of how are we, and I'm sure that there are many people on this conversation, right, who for all different kinds of reasons ensure that we are safe and healthy and have access to the things that we need during this time. But I think that if we're talking about how do we ensure that we are prepared individually and then that we are prepared collectively, we know that there are folks that are put in harm's way much more frequently than others, and that is likely about resources.
Yeah, and I just because I was worried that we might not get to talk about this, I'm just going to interject and say there's a connection made between what you just said, Krista, and said earlier. There are two ways to think about emergency management. and how we respond to crisis. One is to build and prepare in such a way that we can overcome whatever comes at us. This doesn't work. We'll always do it because if we don't, we'll look negligent. But I'm just telling you, it never works. And for any of you who have tried to build an emergency kit or put it in your basement, you know this. And we talked about this when we talked about the 1918 flu pandemic. It never works. You cannot defend your way out of a collective crisis. You just can't. Good luck to you. You might last a little longer. I just read this wonderful book called Raven Rock. I strongly recommend it. It's a story of Cold War bunkers and the development of what happened in sort of developing continuity of government during the Cold War. It's a fascinating study and why this never works. We know what works. So, someone said the other day, what if we had a vaccine all along? And they held up a mask and said, what if we had a vaccine all along? And I thought that was pretty decent, but not great. The vaccine we've had all along is knowing your neighbor. That's the vaccine we've had all along. If you know your neighbor, if you are in communion with those around you, you will change your behavior. You will change your behavior because you will care about the people around you. If you don't know them, you won't. And we can take that from the micro example, which is my neighbor, Nancy, next door. I know her. She's a gourd artist. She takes gourds and she makes them into these beautiful things. She is a former TWA flight attendant. She lives alone. She is advancing in age. She has no handrail on her staircase. These are the things I know about Nancy. I sweep her sidewalk when it snows. My children put her newspaper on the porch. If we know our neighbors, we will wear a mask. If we care about our brown and Black community members, we will recognize the devastating toll of this pandemic. We can get on Zoom, none of us perhaps geographically co-located, and talk with ease. But do we know the people we live with? This is, at its core, the fundamental opportunity in emergency management and crisis preparedness. Simply being in communion with other people. That doesn't cost much. Yet we're spending billions of dollars, billions, as they would say in Austin Powers, in programs designed to put shit on shelves, SOS. And that never works. And you know this because you're unable to do it in your own home. None of you could create a sustainable 7-month home prep kit. You can't do it. I just challenge you to try. I will throw a disaster at you that will make it impossible. But your neighbors could help you. And I really do think that's one of the stories that came through loud and clear here. As the zombies sort of overtook the country from east to west, and no one knew what to do, we were looking for some process solution when in reality, nobody's coming. There's no 911. There's no government ready to take care of you anywhere in the world. But your neighbors will be there. And if that's not enough, we've got a big problem on our hands, Krista, because that's all we've got. Even if you don't like your neighbors, sorry to say, they're the ones next door.
And
be nice to them.
I just wanted to comment on your earlier comment about essentially individualism. There's a Milton Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower's brother, was academic, very intelligent man. He wrote a treatise about the downfall of America would be its individualism, which is what you're talking about. And as you rightly pointed out, it doesn't affect. It affects almost everything that's going on. The healthcare system, food distribution. I mean, it's the economic, the disproportionate distribution of wealth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's really come out in this pandemic. I mean, the pandemic has. I've had numerous people say to me, "Why should I not be able to go out for a beer on a Friday night because you, as an older man, are more susceptible?" Okay, it's not only insulting, but it's just shocking.
Leave it to the young to ask that question.
Yes. Well, and I think if you take at the continuum across the world, from governments or cultures that are very strict, China, to the other end, which is probably the United States, and in the middle somewhere is socialist countries like Europe. I mean, you see the response to this is totally different and much more effective because the attitude is, again, away from the individual and to the community, to the whole. And I mean, I don't know what the answer is, but I think we have to realize that as a nation and as a culture, we've gone so far to emphasize the rights of the individual that we have forgotten about the rights of the whole. And as Ben Franklin once said, and I think this is his quote, is "Your right to swing your fist ends at the tip of my nose." And I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, Michael, you're discussing this classic tension between freedom from and freedom to. And as a lawyer who was trained to understand freedom, I always tell people my first graduate degree was in democracy. And this idea of freedom to and freedom from is at the core of America's tension in terms of rights and everything else. And we're really good at talking about freedom to. We're less good about talking about freedom from. And those are choices we've made. And you've articulated it very well. I believe in freedom from illness. I believe in freedom from oppression. I believe in freedom from religious oppression. That's different than my freedom to not wear a mask, my freedom to congregate with thousands of people. And these aren't right or wrong, but they're not irreconcilable. We just don't have a great vocabulary to talk about freedom. And there's some great philosophical texts about freedom that are really probably require reading for every American, which, as you pointed out earlier, Michael, it's not likely to happen. So we'll have to figure out a way to make that like an animated TV show, like King of the Hill. Maybe we'll have some success.
Well, I mean, Bill Waterston and Calvin and Hobbes tried to use animation, tried to use a comic, right, to teach about philosophy, and that only went so far. Though I do love some Calvin and Hobbes. So I want to make sure that we have a chance to kind of reflect on the last conversation, and then also we have about 14-ish minutes left, and I want to get a quick read from the group about next steps. So let's first start with if anyone wants to offer an additional sort of reflection of the last turn and talk question, which was about kind of how does zombieism reflect existing infectious disease or other infectious disease, and to what end? So any other reflections from the group before we make a decision about how we spend our last 10 minutes or so?
Hi, Krista.
Hey, Rachel.
So our group had a really interesting mix of perspectives. Michael has a background in infectious diseases, and Reba works in the finance industry. And I work in construction, designing and building healthcare facilities. And so we all kind of took the question differently. And Michael mentioned that it was similar in the way it spreads and attacks your brain to mad cow disease and other diseases in that family. I told him I would butcher this, but I'm trying.
You're doing good.
Thanks. And Reba said it was almost like there were two diseases. It was like what happened, when the pandemic first hit the United States, and then kind of a second wave when people who were in industries that were so busy they almost had blinders to what was going on, realized what was happening. So for her, it was getting through all of the PPP applications and finally getting a chance to breathe in the summer, and then getting hit a second time with the realization of what was happening. And then from my perspective, we were still building buildings and going to construction sites and having meetings, and we were taking very minimal precautions because it was something that others get, and that to me was what was very similar to all the zombie movies and zombie shows. Like, it's a far away disease and something that other people get. It's not, it's not really hitting the US right now. It's, there's like one person in Chicago, and so, people, we were working with representatives of hospital programs, and they were joking like, oh, we're doing this thing, and it seemed so over the top for some of these people, because how could it happen to us? So in a lot of ways, yeah, we're it's like we're living the book, kind of.
Thanks, Rachel.
We are.
Yeah, and Chad, do you want to talk a little bit about that, like kind of from the standpoint of disaster preparedness, from the standpoint of like where you are with your work? How have we lived the book, and to what end?
Oh, I don't know. I would invite other people's comment. I mean, you're seeing this happen in real time. We're all sort of living through this in real time. What's interesting is that pandemics happen about every 35 years on average. This pandemic is actually not very exceptional. Just to be honest with you, this is sort of a middling pandemic. I mean, it's not nothing. It's not the worst. The problem is that the human lifespan is relatively short. So while they happen on average every 35 years, the last big one wasn't since 1918 that we've experienced, although we're still in the middle of HIV/AIDS, which, by the way, is a much bigger pandemic. And the problem is when you talk about comparative pandemic size, it looks like we're minimizing one over another, which is not true. It just speaks to the complexity of all of this, right? This is clearly unprecedented in terms of our experience. That is true. That's an undeniable truth. None of us have experienced this. And so as cocksure as I may sound by saying, well, HIV/AIDS, I lived through the 80s, right? Yes, I think Krista's exactly right. There's this difference that's fundamental with HIV and AIDS. And also, by the way, HIV and AIDS was exoticized the way Ebola was, right? So diseases that come out of sub-Saharan Africa are exotic. By the way, that's what got me into science. Maybe some of you, I read Richard Preston's The Hot Zone. I became obsessed with filoviruses and viral hemorrhagic fevers. And I found myself working in an Ebola country during Ebola thinking, holy crap, like, I've prepared my whole life for this moment, and then realizing, no, I didn't. I should have taken health comms, because it turns out that's what was needed. All of my education essentially useless.
Applications now open for the master's program in health communication at IUPUI.
Narrator, so I don't know what others think. I don't know that I have anything really exciting to say on that.
Hey, Chad, this is Mike Rumino again, and I apologize. I'm just going to jump in real quick and mention something.
So Mike, I'll give you a couple of minutes here, but
Okay.
Kim Fletter also has an add-on, so I want to make sure to give her a chance.
Okay, I think we're going to get through this, but we got to be prepared. In 5 to 10 years, we're going to get hit with another. I mean, we saw MERS, we saw SARS, and now we have COVID. SARS-CoV-2 is the name of this virus. And so in the past 20 years, we've had 3 viruses from the same group of a family of viruses. I think reading the people who have been going out, the groups that have been going out and scanning the world looking for things, this is going to happen again. And we should learn. We've got to learn. And we've got to develop better ways of communicating and being prepared for this. This is, I don't think it's going to be 35 years or 100 years. I think it's going to be 10 years.
And listen, Michael, what I would say to you is, this is where I'm about to be controversial. I don't know, maybe it'll be controversial. We have to abandon behavioral principles to get to where you want to go.
I think that it's
I've given up. I've given up on humans.
I think that there's
process engineer. Go ahead, Kim. Sorry.
I think there's perception from our communities and from the larger general population that we know everything about biology. We don't. We only know the tip of it. We are manipulating what we know about biology in very good ways, and it looks like we're winning against biology. But I remember one of the PETA people trying to explain to me how we could just use computers and the programs to determine and remove animal testing and launch these things that haven't been tested on the biological system into the general population just using a computer program. And I'm like, they honestly believed that we knew all this stuff about biology that we really don't know. There's so much we don't comprehend about biology, and we think that we know it. We are perceived as knowing all these things, and maybe if we weren't perceived as knowing all of it, we would get the funding that we needed to know more and be prepared. We don't know enough. We could have known more. But I think all the countries didn't have a vaccine. I mean, I remember at Pharmacia or Pfizer, there used to be a department that didn't make any money, that all they did was try to be ahead of, be able, maybe if we have the vaccine for the next situation, we're going to make a lot of money off of it. Well, they never made any money, so they were removed. But before, they were kept as, this was part of the pipeline possibility. But since we are perceived as, knowing everything, we're not being perceived as what we actually are.
Thanks, Kim. I think that that's a really good point. And I think there's also a great conversation that's happening in the chat that kind of relates to what you were saying about humility, about being sort of open to the idea that we don't know what we don't know, which is one of the things that I think that is so critical to considering how we prepare for these issues. So Chad has been really committed to the idea that we talk about hope. Because, and like Jen and Chad are like, everybody's excited to talk about hope. So one of my extra questions tonight was about hope. We literally got through less than half of the questions that I wrote for tonight. So I'm wondering if maybe we can spend, we've got about 4 minutes left. I would love to talk a little bit about the idea of hope in these spaces, and also make sure that we take some of your questions for Chad. So here's my last question. Maybe Chad, you can respond to this, and then we'll sort of open it up. And one of the things I liked about this book is that it's a book that really starts out talking for most of the book about despair and about just how hard this pandemic is on the people of these stories. But toward the end of the book, I feel like there's a turn toward hope, toward relying on one another, toward connecting to one another, and how that connection is the only thing we as humans have to fight something like this. So Chad, do you want to talk about kind of why you're hopeful in this space and in this time? And then we'll open it up for some questions.
I'm super hopeful, ridiculously hopeful. And I'm hopeful because we don't have an alternative. And so in the absence of a credible alternative, we should adopt that which our brain is most accustomed to liking, and we like hope. And I'm totally comfortable in that space, and you should be too. And you should tell your neighbors the same thing. Max Brooks is comfortable in that space too. It's how he ends his book, page 329. There's this beautiful paragraph, which I'm going to read to you, which I think really summarizes the whole thing, which is, our allies are on their feet again. Things are getting better. We got a few of those white zones to clear, mountains. He's got this great fear about Iceland. I love, by the way, that Iceland is going to be tough. I love that whole thing. That's a whole other, we could do a whole other hour on Iceland. I wish Ivan would let us come in and help out in Siberia, but Russia's going to be Russia. Let Ivan be Ivan. And so right now, every spring as things thaw, we're going to have a few zombies pop out, try and murder us, and we're going to have to deal with it. The numbers are declining, thank heavens, but it doesn't mean people should let down their guard. We're still at war. And until every trace is sponged and purged, and if need be, blasted from the surface of the earth, everybody's got to pitch in and do their job. It would be nice if the lesson people took from all of this misery is that we're all in this together, and just pitch in and do your damn job. I added the damn, by the way. And I do think that's the hope, is that when this gets through, who will be left? Will it be us eggheads saying, you should have listened to me earlier? No, no one will remember us. Sadly, no one will care. Can we create an environment in our communities where people believe that Americans can do anything? I believe it. I do. I believe that human beings can do almost anything. Why don't we try? Wouldn't that feel good? I'd rather fail trying than to not try at all. And I that for me is hope. And maybe that hope rests in science, maybe it rests in prayer for those of you who are faithful, maybe it rests in music, maybe it rests in reading. Wouldn't it be nice if we just did our damn jobs and work together to try? That's what your Red Cross is working on. That's what we're counting on, by the way, of you in crisis, is to do your job, look after your neighbor. That is all I think we can hope for. So let me stop there. I think Max really said it all on that one.
Thanks, Chad. So about a minute or two for questions. I'm just going to pause and stop talking and see if you do have a question. It might be easiest to raise your hand. We're a relatively large group for this point in the evening. So if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand and I'll call on you and we'll go from there.
I'll make a quick comment, not a question, but would
Thanks,
love
Jen.
questions from you and Chad. As I reread this book with the COVID experience right in front of our eyes, the prologue even mentions that universal healthcare is required as an element to recover from the zombie apocalypse. And I was just hooked from the beginning. So I wondered if you all caught that as he opened up as his little twist way back when on how we bring ourselves together as humanity, all centered around taking care of each other.
That's a great point, Jen. And as somebody who works in healthcare, I mean, you know that this is, I never use this space for a political platform, but as much as I will say that, folks need to have access to the care they need no matter what. And that's not a political statement. That's just saying out loud, folks need to have access to the care that they need. And I don't think anybody disagrees with that. It's just a matter of putting aside our differences to get there. And so I really appreciate that and think that that's an important part of the conversation. Other thoughts from the group? Other questions for Chad or for Jen, since we have Jen here? Go ahead, Hannah.
Hannah here. Hello, I had a thought, which I will try to just put out there and we can discuss. But I was thinking about the zombie metaphor. And again, I was thinking, well, the part that doesn't quite work is that once people become zombies, you have to stop thinking of them as human necessarily to survive, right? Like you have the parts at the beginning where people are like putting their infected family members in trunks to try to save them and it doesn't work. But I thought, well, maybe the metaphor does fit though, because there's sort of this epidemic of zombies attacking, but it's also an epidemic of being scared of others essentially. And they eventually defeat that by people coming together and coming up with smart solutions and eventually getting rid of it. So basically from this book club, that made me think about that allegory in a different way. Don't know if anyone else has any other thoughts on that.
Hannah, that's so interesting. Thank you for sharing that comment. I think that the dialectical tension that we experience here is powerful and palpable. And as a communication scholar, I remind folks of all of the places where dialectical tensions exist, where we simultaneously want the same things. And we have to figure out how to negotiate those things, right? Whether that's about being connected to our neighbor while at the same time kind of being concerned that our neighbor may not be as careful as we are, right? Whether that's about, we use lots of heady terms to talk about this, right? So we talk about things like individualism versus collectivism, or connectedness versus independence, right? That all of those dialectics are always there in all of our relationships with one another, zombies or not, pandemic or not. And so being able to communicate effectively with your fellow human being is really critical. And being able to say out loud, like, I'm sometimes afraid to connect with the people that I love. I had to say to my mom this week, I'm not coming home for Thanksgiving. I love you, and I'm not coming home for Thanksgiving. And I think that to me, that's one of those places where interpersonal communication is super critical to be able to negotiate this really well. And I don't know, Chad, if you want to add anything to that or comment on that at all.
No, but how interesting when we look back to it's funny. I've been having those discussions with my parents who are distraught at this meal, which Thanksgiving is important, but is you realize, right, that you may not have great perspective on what the holidays mean for various members of your family until you're in their position, until I'm a grandparent, until I'm older. And And my very calculated mind saying, hey, my number one priority is not killing you. That's kind of my number one plan, right? Keep you alive until Christmas. So really, no, I don't have anything to add other than how interesting is it? All the minds on this book club, all the scientific expertise, all of the policy expertise, and we're still fumbling around in the darkness for the really basic stuff. It is humbling, right? We are not designed for this. This is really our blind spot. And that humility really will carry us if we accept it and embrace it instead of fighting it. And I think that someone talked about humility earlier. For me, it's just what a difference it would make if we said, good, these are really good issues. We don't know. We don't know. Our fear is that if we say we don't know, people will panic, that humans are prone to panic. Humans are not prone to panic. Humans never panic in crisis. They never panic in disasters. Like, I don't know how much evidence we need to tell you humans don't panic. What we do is we tell humans they will panic, and then we act accordingly. But if we just simply said, hey, there's a lot of stuff we don't know, and we need to make some good decisions, and we're going to get about 80% of them right, maybe 70% if we're lucky, and we're going to get some wrong. What we need is you to come with us. It would be a very different discussion with our parents, with our loved ones, with our government, with our colleagues. We wouldn't be arguing about masks, probably, is my guess. Maybe we would.
That's a great
But Krista
point.
and I will say, Krista and I were talking earlier, we did this 1918 flu pandemic discussion in, Krista was like winter of last year. It was before, right before the pandemic. And it's recorded. And we went back and both of us in the spring, without knowing it, watched this recording of this discussion. And we'll have to process that, I think, for some time.
We should write a paper about that, Chad, kind of have that longer debrief about what did we learn from, I mean, truly it was one of the moments where, like, it's pretty rare that I have the opportunity to be like, to really go back and relive some of the experience that I have and think about all the places that I had hubris that I didn't even know that I had, and to think about what it means to be humble in those spaces. Yeah, we will share the 1918 discussion. It's on our Facebook page, the Books, Booze, Brains Facebook page, but and I think probably Indiana Sciences as well. I think you can also link to it from the Indiana Humanities site. So I'll direct you to that location as well. I'm looking at the time. I want to be respectful of Chad's time. I know that he has kiddos that probably want his attention. So I want to pause here and just thank everyone for your incredible connection to one another, for your attention this evening, and remind all of you that we will be back on Tuesday, November 24th. So this is the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, y'all. And we hope that you will be, safe and at home as you've always been. So we'll encourage you to be really careful and take care of one another during this time. We are talking about a book called Predisposed. The subtitle is Liberals, Conservatives, and the Biology of Political Differences. And I'm really excited that we will have Amanda Friesen, who is a political psychologist. Amanda studied with John Hibbing, who is the author of this book. It's going to be right after the election. It's going to be, I think, a really good opportunity for all of us to connect with one another, kind of, again, during these times where things are uncertain. So please read the book, read it with an open heart and an open mind. And I think that Dr. Amanda Friesen is going to give us a lot of really wonderful perspectives related to this book, Predisposed, Liberals, Conservatives, and the Biology of Political Differences. Tuesday, November 24th, we will see you here in the same Zoom room. Please join me in thanking Chad Priest, our amazing expert this evening. Chad, I always love having these conversations with you. I know it's
likewise, Krista. Thank you.
Work for me, but it doesn't really feel like work at all. You are so much fun, and thank you so much for your insights and ideas. This has been great. And thanks to all of you, all of our participants. It's always great to connect with y'all.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Have a great evening. Please be safe. Take care.
Be safe. Take care of one another. We'll see you next month.
you.